I want to begin this evening just by acknowledging again the moment that we're in and the fact that by the nature of this coronavirus, we are all more aware of our vulnerability and mortality in a certain way. And we are experiencing a collective holding of the vulnerability of the human family. And in particular, the unknown right now about the impact this virus is going to have and how many people are going to basically die from this. So it's a very poignant moment. And it's one in which we are facing our mortality and just by nature, the fact that we are mortal creatures. And even to some degree, our own potential mortality, even though, many of us might feel relatively safe right now. And at the same time, this is just an unknown, quite a remarkable unknown. And as Cynthia said, even if we all make it through, which, we think we likely will, and we're going to do our best to honor the sheltering and the quarantining and stay present with what's required, we are in a moment where our entire normal ways of being are shutting down. And this is unprecedented, I think, in human history, at least at this scale, across the whole human family coming together in this, collective shutdown of our normal day-to-day way of living. And so there is a kind of death there. And I think why we wanted to bring this conversation and this information tonight is because part of I think one of the greatest shadow sides of our so-called modern Western civilized culture is an incredibly fearful relationship to our mortality, that we basically have a deep, deep fear of death that is embedded in us. All human beings experience fear of death. I mean, it's a natural reality that we all are aware of. The Buddha says it so beautifully: the most certain thing in life is death, the most uncertain thing is when. So that is just part of the nature of being a creature. However, the understanding of death and what happens after death in the contemporary culture, and in particular in our scientific worldview, is being revealed in recent decades to be extremely limited and short-sighted. And so that's why we wanted to talk about this body of evidence and data that is called near-death experience. Now, I'm sure a number of you have heard of this. It's been around, in terms of the scientific studies on it. The first one I'm aware of was in the 1800s, the late 1800s. And I'm forgetting the man's name, but it was a Scottish physicist whose wife was a nurse working with dying patients. And she kept having all of these remarkable experiences that she reported to him. And so he began to document them and published a book in the late 1800s that basically questioned our whole understanding of death. I'm forgetting the name of it. I didn't mean to I forgot about that book until this moment, but I'm just mentioning that that was one of the early studies on near-death experience, that there was more going on than the kind of clinical model tells us. And then there was a famous book published by Raymond Moody called Life After Life in around 1975-ish. Again, I don't have that exact timing. And that really began the main research into this whole phenomenon of near-death experience. And it's been accelerating really ever since, with, I should say, quite a bit of resistance from the mainstream scientific community. And because it suggests the possibility that in some way the consciousness survives physical death, that human consciousness survives the death of the physical body. This is what near-death experience data begins to point to. So, but let's just have a look at the data for a moment. I mean, just summary. This is just, I'm basically presenting the summary overview of some of these key findings. And to do that, I'm going to move into share screens. Okay, so this is the first little piece of data that's important to recognize, that this is not an infrequent phenomenon. It's not an everyday phenomenon either, but there are about 25 million people, according to the best recent research, that have had this form, some form of a near-death experience. These happen in different ways when one is, for example, in cardiac arrest, heart attacks, you know, certain life-threatening medical conditions can induce, well, a near-death experience can occur during those. So cardiac arrest is something we'll look at in a moment because it's a very particular form that's very compelling. But they can also happen in car accidents, in emergencies, in crimes, where someone is shocked into another state of consciousness and experiences a kind of death experience. There are certain features of near-death experience, like out-of-body experience, that also happen in meditation. And in spiritual kind of practices, there can be sometimes a out of body or some sense of entering a realm beyond our normal conscious awareness. So there's a lot of ways in which these experiences come about. I want to, let's see, I need to move forward here. So just to summarize some of the common characteristics of the near-death experience. Many of you may have seen some documentaries and summaries of this. And at the end, I have some resources for those who want to look into this. I do recommend some of the better documentaries on it. So again, well, I'll get to that. Let me just go right into the data here. So one of the most significant studies, I think it was published around 2001 or 2002, was conducted by a Dutch cardiologist named Pim van Lommel. And he has a book called Consciousness After Death. I think that's the name. Anyway, he did a clinical study of 344 cardiac arrest patients, 62 of whom had near-death experiences. Now, a little bit about his background. Now, Pim van Lommel was a cardiologist since the early 60s. He was a full-on regular scientific doctor, MD. And when he first heard about near-death experience, he thought, that is ridiculous. I've never heard of it. I don't know anything about this, and I don't believe it's real. And I've been, you know, had been a cardiologist working with cardiac arrest patients for years. So what he did, though, when he heard about this, is he thought, well, I'm going to find out. And he wrote a letter to all of his previous patients that he'd ever had and said, have any of you ever had this experience? And when they wrote back, there was a very significant proportion. I think it was 18%, but it was 18% in this particular study. You can see 62 is 18%. But in any case, he found that a significant portion, not huge, but a significant portion of his patients had had a near-death experience and had never told him. And he was astounded. He thought, how is it that I never knew this? So he began to really explore these data intensively. And he's now one of the world's leading researchers in this field, and very prominent and very compelling. He's got videos on YouTube. So if you want to really understand it from a clinician who's researched this deeply, he's one that I would recommend to look into. And so here's the summary of his data from these 62 people in this study that had near-death experiences, and what are some of the common characteristics. And they are, where did my cursor go? Okay, here it is. First of all, the person is aware that they are dead. They have a feeling that they have gone. And often that they think they're not coming back. And of course, often they don't want to come back. That's another factor. Second thing is this positive emotions. There's often a very profound, not always, but most often, a very profound experience of a deep peace. In a sense, the peace that passeth all of understanding, if you will, and a sense of great harmony and joy, some kind of deep positive emotions that are surprising to people, especially when they realize that they may have just died. Then there's often an out-of-body experience, and that's the sense of rising up as a spirit being, as a field of consciousness, if you will, and then floating away from the body, often if it's in a medical situation, above the ceiling, or if it's in a car accident situation, above the car, seeing the accident, seeing all of the, the horror really of the accident itself, but seeing it from above and outside the body, as if one was looking down on it from a kind of, virtual drone or something. And then a very common characteristic is the sense of moving through a tunnel. Very classic near-death experience, often a sense of moving through a tunnel and through some kind of a portal of some kind. And then often experiencing some kind of light or light being. And it's usually described as a very beautiful light to which there's a very natural attraction. And sometimes it's with a being that's made of light. And other times it's just kind of a pure light essence. And then often vivid colors are involved, a very vivid perception of colors. And then sometimes these very remarkable visions of a kind of heavenly or celestial landscape is not uncommon. And then a life review, and this is a classic idea that one's whole life sort of passes before one, and that there's kind of a whole tapestry of one's own life experience that is revealed. And then there's often meeting with deceased persons, often relatives, who will actually greet the person and actually have a kind of conversation with them. This is quite frequent in near-death experience. People they haven't seen, parents, others who passed away, often very profound healing and celebratory experiences there. And then there's this presence of a border, a kind of a borderline that they have crossed over into another realm, which is beyond this life. And of course, in a near-death experience, by definition in the near-death experience, the person didn't stay dead, if you will. They came back, and there's a sense of crossing back over that border back into this life in one way or another. So this is a brief summary of some of the main characteristics of near-death experience. And now some of the effects, just to summarize, that this has on people. When they, I don't know, there's a little yellow line there, but won't worry about it. I was just noticing on my screen. So when they come back, when the person comes back from the near-death experience, what are some of the effects that it has on their consciousness and on their life? And one of the first and most important is the loss of fear of death. And this is really very, very significant, because when you have 25 million people who have come back from essentially crossing the border to the other side and then come back and are collectively reporting the loss of a fear of death, this is a very profound and important teaching for the rest of us, and a very important teaching about the nature of consciousness. Next one is very often a new awareness of a deeper purpose and meaning in life and key spiritual insights. And very, very often they come back with a sense of love and truth like they have never known, that just fills them with such joy, and often will give them a new lease on life, and sometimes a whole new sense of life purpose. And just wanting, they often report coming back with just the absolute importance of love, how profound it is, and how all they want to do is be an instrument of love and serve love in some way. Next one is an increased self-esteem, some kind of seeing themselves as this spiritual essence that, before they may have sort of perceived themselves as sort of a plodding human being, and now they've experienced this exalted dimension of their own being. So there's a kind of a beholding of their own soul that has taken place in some way, and the majesty and the glory of that. And so this actually transforms their psyche in a very significant way. And of course, naturally, that often leads to the person becoming more open, caring, and loving. There are some dramatic examples of some real curmudgeon types who had a near-death experience and came back, and really, after, 30 minutes, 40 minutes in this other space, or sometimes just a few minutes, and they come back with this radical change in their character because of the insights that they've had during the near-death experience. And of course, that leads to a change in attitude toward life and others. And there are certain cases, you probably have heard of this book by Eben Alexander, Proof of Heaven. Important book. It's because it was written by a neuroscientist, a neurosurgeon, who didn't believe in these things. And to his credit, he actually says in the beginning of that book that he had heard of near-death experience. He was a scientist, he was a real scientist. And of course, he didn't believe in that stuff. He knew there was data on it, he'd heard of it, but he knew it couldn't possibly happen because there was no way to explain it based on neuroscience. And so it couldn't possibly be real. And so he didn't even need to look at the data. He could ignore it. Well, then he had himself a medical crisis, and he had a full-blown near-death experience, totally transformed him. And so now he's one of the scientific neurosurgeon spokespeople for near-death experience, for which he is still to this day widely ridiculed by some of his mainstream colleagues. But he's carrying forth with that. And that's happening more and more. That Pim van Lommel and Eben Alexander and a whole group of scientists now, many of them, as well as Bruce Grayson and some of these other people, I forget some of the other names, certainly Raymond Moody, are out there really laying it out now at a whole new level. It's really quite inspiring. And part of the reason they're doing it is because they think it has such profound teachings for us all, for the ordinary person. The next one is this causes people to re-examine their existing relationships, to really look at, the impact of these new insights, the loss of fear of death, the increased self-esteem, more open, caring, loving, that changes relationships. And it can lead to adjustment challenges. Someone has a medical emergency, they go into the hospital, they come out with a whole new, who is this person? And it can seem a little trite or challenging to people who knew them before. And there, have been times when it leads to really emotional and relationship challenges leading to divorce. And so it's not always easy to readjust. It's also not always easy to readjust to one's job. One comes back and one may not be able to stay in that profession. One feels a calling to something else. And how do you make that transition? It's not so simple. So it's not all rosy by any means. And then there's challenges also of fear of being believed. Now, this is really significant because actually it's very interesting because there's a nice story about this when Pim van Lommel tells the story. He was giving a talk on near-death experience on this study of 344 patients to a major conference of other doctors and physicians. And one of them, an elderly gentleman, got up and just said, "This is such hogwash. This is such complete bunk. I have been, a clinician in the emergency room for all these years. I've been with all these patients who were basically dying and near death. I mean, not dying, they were dying. Cardiac arrest, the whole thing came back to life. I have never heard of any of this. This is total, pseudoscience hogwash." And then there was a hand that went up and basically said, raised his hand, another doctor in there who got up and said, "I was one of your patients. And I am one of those patients who was on your table, whose life you saved, for which I'm very grateful. And I had a full-blown near-death experience. And I have to tell you that you are the last person I would ever tell about that." And basically what this doctor realized was that his patients didn't talk about this because it's so taboo, and it was so taboo in his consciousness. There was no room. There was no openness. And so that's why he'd never heard of it, because of his own attitude toward it was such that this was such an intimate and important experience. These patients wouldn't even tell him. And that was quite a remarkable case where Pim van Lommel didn't even have to respond to the question. The doctor objected, the other patient raised his hand, and Pim van Lommel just let that whole thing speak for itself and went on. To the next question, please. So anyway, and it's not all sweetness and light, and I think this is important to recognize. In a small percentage of cases, there have been some really challenging experiences in near-death experience of feeling, out of control, frightened, totally alone, or experiences of hell, some kind of hellish experience. It's very rare. I think it's definitely a small percent. I think it's like 1 or 2%. I don't have the numbers right here, but it's very rare, but it does happen. So a near-death experience isn't always positive. Most often it is. I realize there's a lot of information here, so just bear with me. I'll be done in just a few minutes, but I think it's really important to see this whole thing and the whole body of this information taken together as a whole. Now, let's see. I need to find my cursor. So, okay, here we go. So I want to tell you one very important case. There's different types of, there's 2 aspects of experience in near-death experience that can be independently verified. So this is something that's really important to understand. One is called veridical out-of-body experience. Veridical means the person who has a near-death experience has an out-of-body experience, and they go and they perceive something else. They go visit somewhere or someone, or they go witness something that they couldn't have known about. And later it's verified. They bring back this information and it's later verified by others independently. That's called a veridical out-of-body experience. Pam Reynolds I'll give you the case of hers in a moment. The other one is called shared death experience. And good old Raymond Moody, in 2010, I think it is, published after, 35 years of this research since his first book. And I think he'd published other books in between. But he published the first real study on shared death experience, and there's been more data on that coming forward. I'll speak about that in a moment. But in terms of a veridical out-of-body experience, Pam Reynolds was a 35-year-old woman who had a very remarkable out-of-body experience. But part of the reason, actually it wasn't that remarkable. It was remarkable. But what's remarkable about it more are the circumstances under which it occurred and the fact that it was clinically verified. Her veridical out-of-body experience was clinically verified. So this young woman in Arizona had a huge aneurysm near her brain stem. And for them to go in and take it out would have been totally life-threatening. And so they would kill her in the process. And so they came up with a very unusual medical procedure. I'm having some trouble with there we go. The doctors performed a very rare and risky surgical procedure called a standstill operation, in which they literally cooled her body down to 60 degrees, stopped her breathing, stopped her heart, drained the blood out of her brain, and then from her entire body, they literally drained all her blood out, stored it in a vat. And then that drained the aneurysm, and they were able to go in and remove the aneurysm and then put her back together. So she was clinically dead for a full hour. No heartbeat, no breathing, flatline EKG, no brain waves, no sensations. All of this was verified by all the medical detectors and equipment that they had on her. And so she couldn't, there was absolutely no conscious functioning at all of her brain. And then the aneurysm was removed, as I mentioned. She later reported an extremely powerful out-of-body experience in which she floated above the operating table and precisely recounted the size and the shape of the specific surgical instruments that were used. And there were a couple of unexpected developments that happened, oh, this isn't going right, we have to do this. She was able to accurately report everything, which she said she witnessed. She saw which drawers the nurses put in the particular tools that they were using. She was able to recount that later. She saw it all like she was recording it from a video up above the table and witnessed the whole thing. Her eyes were completely covered. She heard exactly what they were saying. So, and then more than 20 doctors and nurses present were able to verify her post-operative account of what happened. So it blew everyone away. It was a very remarkable validation of what happened during her clinical death in her out-of-body experience. And then, in addition to all of that, she entered a classic vortex tunnel and went through some of the classic aspects of the near-death experience. You know, the beautiful bright light, met many beings of light, deceased relatives who loved and nurtured her, but would not let her cross that boundary. Her uncle finally led her back through the tunnel, and seeing her own dead body, the last thing she wanted to do was go in. But her uncle kind of pushed her back in. She said it was like diving into a clear pool of ice water. And Pam Reynolds recovered fully and lived another 19 years. So this experience is one of the more dramatic veridical out-of-body experiences because it was observed under such precise clinical conditions. And there's an interesting story about this, which I'll tell very briefly. But you probably remember the scientist, astronomer, Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer who did that whole series on cosmos, and is really one of the most brilliant scientists of the 20th century. Anyway, he got quite interested in the work of Stanislav Grof, who, as you know, has developed the holotropic breathwork, but it was also one of the founding pioneers, along with Ken Wilber and, you know, Francis Vaughan and Roger Walsh and others, of the entire field of transpersonal psychology, which is the psychology of spirituality, if you will. And so they had 2 or 3 meetings in which basically Carl Sagan challenged Stan on his views, because he said, you know, all these things that are happening, there's a purely materialistic explanation for them. And so Stan was trying to convince Carl that there's another realm of experience that is not totally related to the matter-energy reactions. And so they got into this debate, and at one point Stan brought in this whole phenomenon of veridical out-of-body experiences and near-death experience, and he summarized the case of Pam Reynolds and another one. And Carl Sagan's response was, well, of course that didn't happen. And Stan said, you know, he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He said, it did happen. It was clinically reported. It was witnessed by, you know, 20 other clinicians, and it's been reported in the medical literature. This happened. This is a reality. And then Carl Sagan sat there and kept turning his head and trying to figure it out. And finally he said, well, you know, there's a lot of doctors out there, and they come up with stuff, and it was some kind of fraud, and they conjured it up and put it out as a PR trick. And Stan couldn't believe his ears. And Carl stuck to his story. And he realized that Carl Sagan had no capacity to open his scientific mind to this type of data. And this is not to critique Carl Sagan. It's to show the process that takes place when new data is coming to scientists who just can't open their minds to it. As Max Planck once said, you know, science advances one funeral at a time, meaning that the old guard have to die off because they can't fully embrace some of the new incoming data. And Max Planck said that new scientific theories do not advance by the skeptics being convinced from the new and exciting data. It happens more often by the skeptics dying and the new scientists who come in from a young age with that data and take it for granted. And I think we're seeing that in terms of the near-death experience data. There is massive resistance to it even today, even though the evidence is mounting dramatically. So anyway, that was a kind of the end of Grof's and Carl Sagan's relationship. But there's more on this, and I want to just check our time here. Okay, well, I'll just briefly, this is another study in 2008 with over 2,000 patients. And you can see in bold there the key things, that the experience of death appears to be far broader than previously understood. And so there was a kind of a deeper understanding of the whole realm of near-death experience, and that the out-of-body experiences sometimes may correspond with actual events because of the memories of visual awareness that people would have. This, again, is essentially veridical, what we're talking about, veridical near-death experience. And a higher proportion of people may have vivid death experiences but don't recall them. This is another thing, that near-death experience may be more common, but because of the drugs and stuff, and the sedative and the impacts, the psychoactive impacts on their memory circuits, there may be a larger percentage who actually have those experiences, but then when they come back, don't actually recall them. And then they also suggested that future near-death experiences should focus on cardiac arrest because it's biologically synonymous with death, rather than on other medical conditions that it's not clear always whether the person is clinically dead. But in cases of cardiac arrest in a clinical setting, there's no question that the EKG is dead, the heart is not pumping, the person is clinically dead. And lastly, they are calling for a much more open-minded research because there's so much prejudice against near-death experience in the scientific community. The critics, just so we can be honest to summarize their complaints. First of all, acceptance of these data is slow but growing. It's difficult sometimes to verify the anecdotal accounts. I mean, people come with these incredible reports, but there's no way to tell if that's a made-up experience or what's going on really. So it's a very nice experience you had, but so what? With the out-of-body veridical experience, that's really one area, and the other one where there is an independent verification, and the other one I'll mention in a moment. It's difficult to know if a person claiming NDE was actually clinically dead at the time. That's why the focus now on cardiac arrest patients. Then there's this whole question of NDEs might just be hallucinations from a dying brain rather than some transcendental realities. Or it might just be a neurological phenomenon, which is as yet poorly understood. So in this category, and of course, those are legitimate critiques. We don't understand what's going on. It might just be some bizarre, neurological or hallucinatory phenomenon, particularly taking in a place in a brain that's dying. If the thing is dying, it's not working properly. It's kind of like a television set goes haywire, and all of a sudden you get all these images on the screen, and they're not really there, and it's not really part of the programming. So what the kind of counter evidence to that is this phenomenon called shared death experience, where there are a number of cases where there is a dying patient and they go through a near-death experience, and then loved ones, sometimes present at the deathbed, but other times in a distant place, even hundreds or thousands of miles away, enter into an experience as well and go through a very powerful experience where they enter into that borderland and into the realm beyond this realm of consciousness, the other side, if you will, and come back and report an identical experience to what the NDE person reports. And so it's not just the patient, if you will, the actual person who almost died that is reporting this incredible experience, but some of their loved ones who actually went there with them. And this is a whole phenomenon. There's a number of documented cases of this called shared death experience. And the thing is, in those cases, the loved ones who went through that experience do not have a dying brain. Their brain is functioning perfectly normally, but they also went into this transcendental reality that the near-death person was going into. So that becomes a body of controverting evidence for this idea that it might just be hallucinations from a dying brain. And lastly, this is challenging the whole materialist model of consciousness and the mind-brain separation model, which says that consciousness can exist independently from the brain. And that is really the hypothesis that's coming now more and more, that the brain can die, but that consciousness continues. So this, I'm gonna maybe, this is another whole body. I don't know that we have time for this. What do you think? How do you feel? Is this too much? It's a lot of work, a lot of information. Maybe why don't we?
Great. It's good. How long will this part take?
Well, it's another whole arena of reincarnation research. So I'll do it at another time. Let's move forward. I want to stick to the near death and maybe summarize these important consciousness studies. So these, first of all, these studies, because this is kind of a summary of the essence of, and we'll leave it here. That basically there are now hundreds of studies of these that are basically published in peer-reviewed journals from studies done across the world. And taken together, they are strongly pointing to the likelihood of the survival of human consciousness after bodily death. And I don't know if some of you know the series of Skeptico, the podcast by Alex Tsakiris, very interesting. But he's interviewed many of these NDE, near-death experience researchers, and he's found that all of them have come to this conclusion. Many of them were skeptics beforehand, but when they actually did the research and worked with the near-death experience clients, they came away being convinced that human consciousness does survive the physical death of the body. And this, of course, is one of the foundational teachings of all of the spiritual traditions. And the mystics have reported this for thousands of years. So if we just look at one thing I like to say sometimes, like the Bhagavad Gita says, the person does not die when the body dies. That's right there at the beginning of chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita. So, science is 2,500 years behind the mystics on this one, and needs to catch up because human family needs this information. So the next point, taken together, these studies are now pointing strongly towards some aspect of human consciousness that survives physical death and it is not embodied in the material domain. Essentially, the existence of some kind of human soul. And many scientists already regard this as constituting proof of the soul. And my conviction is that in this century and probably in the next few decades, this will be widely accepted and will then become a whole new frontier of very exciting, pioneering research. Whereas today it is still mightily opposed by many of the mainstream forces in the scientific orthodoxy, if you will, and in particular by those who control the purse strings on research. And the reason is because these studies strongly challenge orthodox materialist assumptions that are still widely held, that the human being is merely a kind of biological robot, that we are a machine, basically, and that consciousness is nothing but what is called an epiphenomenon, simply a side effect of the neurophysiology in the brain. This is the mainstream dogma today, still. And you can get on YouTube and find plenty of debates on this, and you'll see that position is widely held. Nevertheless, my little personal prediction is that this data, and it's not just this data, it's the other data that we'll be looking at in future courses, but I think the NDE data, the near-death data, is one of the most compelling toward the scientific discovery of the soul. And in particular, it is going to liberate us, humanity, from this widespread fear of death that we have carried with such loathing. And it's going to open up a whole domain of taking much more seriously the data of consciousness research, the data of meditation research, and the mystery of the life force, as well as to open up the human family, the scientific dimension of our awareness, to the spiritual teachings from across the ages. So it's a very auspicious development, in my view, that is coming down the pike right here, right now in our lifetimes, and is continuing to unfold. And the last thing I'll say about it in relation to quantum physics, we've been looking at quantum physics, it also really relates to the wave-particle duality. It's almost like the wave continues after the particle vanishes. In a way, the particle may die, but the wave continues. Some aspect of the essence of the particle continues in its waveform, even when the particle is annihilated. And in a certain sense, that may have application to human consciousness. And the last thing about that is that whereas quantum physics sometimes can be seen, it's very exciting, and it opens us to challenging our normal ways of perceiving life. And it's been doing that for 100 years for those who really are able to embrace it. But it also is often seen as a very high, refined, arcane area of scientific knowledge requiring, if you're going to really understand it, mathematics and deep training in physics, and even then you don't understand it. But it's kind of almost too esoteric for ordinary people. That's how it's still perceived in some ways. Whereas near-death experience has a direct message to ordinary people, because it is ordinary people who have these experiences, ordinary people who come back with these extraordinary reports. And as that data becomes more part of our conscious awareness and the uniformity of the experiences that they tend to bring back, there is this discovery then and this awakening to the spiritual dimension of life, and hopefully a lessening of the fear of our own mortality, and a deeper appreciation of the great spiritual teaching that life and death with a small d are just two opposite poles of a larger supreme mystery of life with a capital L. So I think I will leave it there for tonight. And we will move into some silence to contemplate all of this material. I know it's been a lot of information, and I'll give some resources at the end if you want to pursue it further. But I hope it's been helpful.
We're going to move into really about 10 minutes of silent meditation. And what we invite is just for you to be with in the silence, just to see what arises in your own heart from all that's been shared. I want to just acknowledge that some of you on this in this course may have had a near-death experience, and just want to honor anyone that's been through that process of what you've been through. And I also want to honor in the sense of all that we're going through now as a collective. So this information is very important, because while we're in an acute situation with just tending to the people that are ill, physically ill, and dying, there's a lot of secondary factors that aren't really secondary, they're just equal to, but are unrecognized. And even that shared journeying, that shared death experience, I think that's probably going on now with some of the people when they can't be with their loved ones when they're dying. What's happening on that invisible realm that we don't even know. So just holding the larger aspect of all of this in our conscious awareness. So we're going to move into the silence, and just I invite you to be in that silence and see what arises in your own heart, not from your mind's place, but try to just let it integrate into your heart of all that's been shared, and listen to what comes, if anything, from that silent depth of your own heart. And so as you're able, just invite you to close your eyes or have a soft gaze. And I will set the bell here, and when you hear it, you'll have two rings when it's time to come back out of the meditation.
So maybe we'll just take a moment of silent prayer, just recognizing that we are entering into a collective near-death experience of our ways of being in society and even in civilization. That the normal ways have ceased for some time, and that we're all in a deep inner reflection. And if we can use this time skillfully to connect with spirit, to reconnect with the very source of life, and with the source of the source, the supreme absolute, ineffable, eternal, indestructible mystery that sometimes we call God. And may you be protected, and may you be well, may you be safe, and may you be ever in communion and remembrance with God. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.